The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning hum when the recording began to play. My daughter-in-law's voice filled the room first, low and deliberate the way she always spoke when she thought she was being smart. "He's not going to live forever, Owen. We need to move now, before he changes anything." Then my son's voice, hesitant at first, the way he'd been hesitant about everything since she came into his life. "What if something goes wrong?" And her answer, the one that made two jurors visibly flinch. "Nothing will go wrong. He'll be confused. He's already confused half the time. Nobody's going to question it. We just need to get him out of that house." I watched my son's face as his own words played back in a courtroom full of strangers. He was 41 years old and he looked about 12. The color had left him completely. My attorney, a sharp-edged woman named Carol Simmons, who I'd hired specifically because she reminded me of no one I'd ever liked, let the silence sit after the recording ended. Then she said quietly, "Ladies and gentlemen, that is not a conversation between two people worried about an elderly father. That is a conversation between two people planning to get rid of one." The judge didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Let me back up, because this didn't start in a courtroom. It started in my own kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, when I was 68 years old and my son told me I needed to see a doctor about my memory. My name is Donald Marsh. I spent 32 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon at Virginia Mason Medical Center in Seattle. I operated on over 4,000 hearts. I have never in my adult life been confused about where I am or what day it is. But that morning, Owen sat across from me at my kitchen table. The table his mother and I bought at an estate sale in 1987. The one with the small burn mark near the left corner from a candle she knocked over at Christmas dinner, and told me, carefully, that he and his wife Stacy were worried. "I'd left the stove on," he said. "I'd forgotten about a dentist appointment. I'd called him by his cousin's name twice. I hadn't done any of those things. I knew it with the same certainty I knew my own surgical record. But Owen looked so earnest, so genuinely concerned, and Stacy sat behind him with her hands folded and her eyes soft with practiced worry. And I actually thought in that moment, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I am slipping, and I just can't see it. That's the thing about being gaslit by someone who knows you well. They use your own humility against you. Owen knew I was the kind of man who second-guessed himself. His mother used to tease me about it. "You spent 3 hours second-guessing a perfectly good dinner reservation, Donald. You're the only person I know who apologizes to restaurant hosts." So when my son told me I was forgetting things, my first instinct wasn't to defend myself. It was to wonder if he was right. I made a doctor's appointment, came back clean. Cognition testing, memory recall, neurological screening, all of it exactly where it should be for a man my age. My physician, who had known me for 11 years, actually laughed a little when he showed me the results. "Donald, if everyone your age had numbers like these, I'd be out of half my business." I came home and told Owen. He nodded slowly and said that was good news. Stacy smiled and said she was so relieved, and then, 2 weeks later, she brought up the house. The house is in Bellevue, Washington, 4 bedrooms on a half-acre that backs up to a greenbelt. My wife Sandra and I built it in 1994, added the sunroom in 2002, the year our younger son Michael was born. Sandra died in 2018 from pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and I have lived in that house alone since then, which Owen and Stacy had apparently decided was a problem requiring their personal solution. Stacy's idea, and I knew it was Stacy's because Owen never in his life had the imagination for long-range manipulation, was that I should add them to the deed, for protection, she said, in case something happened to me. She'd done research, she told me, and there are all kinds of legal complications that arose when an elderly person died without clear co-ownership of their primary residence. She said the word elderly with tremendous care, the way you'd handle something fragile. I told her I had an estate attorney. She said estate attorneys didn't always catch everything. I told her my estate was in excellent order. She said she just wanted to help. I did not add them to the deed, but I started paying attention. The thing about spending 3 decades in an operating room is that you get very good at reading situations without showing that you're reading them. You learn to watch without looking like you're watching. You track a dozen variables simultaneously, and you don't announce which one you're most concerned about. You stay calm when things go wrong because panic is contagious and someone in the room has to be the steady one. Those skills translate. Over the next 4 months, I began to notice things. Stacy going through my desk while I was in the garden. I'd set a very thin piece of tape across the top drawer, the old-fashioned kind my father had shown me, and it was broken 3 times in 6 weeks. Owen asking questions about my retirement accounts, my pension, the life insurance policy I'd maintained since 1989. Small questions, dropped casually into conversation, never pressing, always retreating the moment I looked at him directly. Stacy mentioning twice a financial advisor she'd heard about who specialized in estate transitions for seniors. I started writing things down, dates, times, what was said, who was present. I bought a small digital recorder and kept it in my shirt pocket. I had a security system installed, cameras at every exterior door and in the main living areas, framing it to Owen as a concern about package theft, which had been a real problem in the neighborhood that year. He helped me set it up. He tested the camera angles himself. I also called Michael. Michael is 31, lives in Portland, works in environmental law. He and Owen have never been close. 11 years between them, different mothers in terms of temperament if not biology, and Stacy had done a quiet, systematic job of edging Michael out of the family picture over the years. Forgotten to tell him about Thanksgiving. Mentioned offhand that I'd said I wanted a quiet Christmas. Small things, easy to explain individually, impossible to dismiss as a pattern. Michael drove up in April. I sat him down at that kitchen table and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities. When I finished, he said, "Dad, how long have you been tracking this?" I told him 4 months. He said, "Okay, what do you need from me?" I told him I needed him to be patient and to trust me and not to confront Owen yet. He said he could do that. The thing I hadn't expected, the thing that changed everything from a slow burn suspicion into something with real legal weight, happened in June, on a Friday evening when I'd told Owen and Stacy I was flying down to visit an old colleague in San Francisco. I wasn't in San Francisco. I was in my own sunroom with the lights off, sitting in the dark with a cup of tea, because I'd had a feeling. I'd had feelings like that before, in surgery. The kind where every reading was normal but something in your peripheral awareness said, "Pay attention." I had learned, over 32 years, to trust those feelings. Owen and Stacy let themselves in with the spare key at 7:45. They didn't turn on the main lights. They went directly to my study. I could hear Stacy's voice through the door, not the words, just the rhythm, low and quick, and the sound of my filing cabinet opening. I sat still. I did not move. The recorder in my shirt pocket was already running. They were in the study for 20 minutes. When they came out, Stacy was holding a folder. She said to Owen in the hallway just outside the sunroom door, "This is the one. This is what Jennifer said to look for." Owen said, "Are you sure it's the right one?" She said, "It matches the notary stamp. We just need someone to make a clean copy." They left. I sat in the dark for a long time after the front door closed. What they'd taken was a copy of my will. I called my estate attorney the next morning. His name is Philip Garrett, and I have known him since 1999. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Donald, I think you need to call someone else too." This someone else was a private investigator named Lou Castillo, who had worked financial fraud cases for the King County Prosecutor's Office for 20 years before going private. Lou was compact, quiet, and thorough in the way that very good investigators always are. No drama, no theories, just documentation. Over the following 6 weeks, Lou found the following. Owen and Stacy had met 3 times with a man named Terrence Webb, who had a prior conviction for document fraud in Arizona and currently ran a notary and document services business in Renton under a different name. They had wired $4,200 to an account connected to Webb's business. They had also, and this was the part that made Philip go very still when I told him, attempted to file a change of beneficiary form on my life insurance policy, using a signature that was not mine. That last one crossed from civil territory into criminal. Philip called his contact at the King County Prosecutor's Office. Lou had his documentation ready. I had 4 months of recordings, security footage, and a detailed written log that I'd kept with the same precision I'd used for surgical notes. We were told to wait, to let it develop a little further, to give them enough rope. I was also told very clearly not to tip my hand. That was the hardest part. Sitting across from Owen at dinner, he and Stacy came over twice in July, cheerful and attentive, Owen grilling steaks in the backyard like he used to when he was young, and none of this had happened yet. And just talking, asking about work, laughing at a story he told about his commute, passing him the corn. He had no idea. I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed, about what it means to know something about a person that they don't know, you know, about whether I was grieving already or still hoping I was wrong, or both. They arrested Owen and Stacy on a Thursday morning in September. Lou had called me the night before to let me know it was happening. I was sitting on my back patio when my phone rang and Owen's number came up on the screen at 9:37 in the morning, and I let it ring. I already knew why he was calling. Michael drove up from Portland that same afternoon. He didn't say anything when he came in, just put his arms around me in the front hallway and stood there. I am not a man who cries easily. I have seen the inside of too many human bodies to be sentimental in the ordinary way, but I stood there in my own front hallway and I was very grateful for my younger son. The trial was in February. By that point, I'd had 6 months to get used to the idea of what was happening, but walking into that courthouse and seeing Owen in a suit that no longer fit him right because he'd lost weight since September, that was something you didn't get used to exactly. You just got through it. Carol Simmons was everything I'd hired her to be. She laid out the evidence methodically, without theatrics, the way you present a complex diagnosis. Here's what we found, here is what it means, here is what it means, here is why there is no other reasonable interpretation. The recordings, the security footage, the financial records, Lou Castilla's testimony, the insurance fraud, which the prosecution called Exhibit A in a systematic pattern of financial predation against a vulnerable family member. I was not, for the record, vulnerable, but I understood why the framing served the case. Stacy's attorney was a man named Gould, who wore good suits and had the practiced confidence of someone who'd won cases he shouldn't have. He made his arguments carefully. Stacy hadn't understood the legal implications of the insurance form, he said. She'd been trying to help. Owen had led her into this situation. The recordings were taken out of context. The document work with Webb had been exploratory, not criminal. Carol let him finish, and then she played the recording from my sunroom hallway. This is the one. This is what Jennifer said to look for. We just need someone to make a clean copy. The jury had heard a lot by that point, but that recording sat in the room differently than everything else, because it was Stacy's voice and it was in my home at night in the dark while I was supposed to be 3 states away. There was no innocent explanation for that sentence. Gould knew it. I watched him know it. They called me to the stand on the 4th day. Gould started the same way these attorneys always start, soft, almost sympathetic, establishing that I was a grieving widower, that I'd been lonely since Sandra died, that Owen had genuinely been trying to be present in my life, that relationships between aging parents and their adult children were complicated. I agreed with most of it. Yes, I'd been lonely. Yes, Owen had been attentive, especially in the year after Sandra died. Yes, our relationship had been good once. Then he said, "And isn't it possible, Dr. Marsh, that you misread a difficult situation? That what you interpreted as a scheme was actually your son and daughter-in-law trying, clumsily, to manage their concerns about your future?" I looked at him steadily. I said, "Mr. Gould, I have spent 32 years in operating rooms making high-stakes decisions based on available evidence. Clumsiness leaves a different trail than intent. The evidence in this case points to intent." He tried a different angle. He said that installing hidden cameras in my own home, retaining a private investigator, keeping detailed logs of my son's visits, wasn't that an excessive response to a vague suspicion? Didn't it suggest I was looking for something to find? I said, "I found what was there to find. The question isn't whether I was looking. The question is what I found when I looked." He sat down a few minutes later, not because he was done, but because he'd run out of road. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I sat with Michael in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse on the first day, and we talked about Sandra for the first time in a long time. Not about her death, but about her, about who she was, the way she'd argued with me about everything and been right more often than I was, the way she'd adored Owen when he was small, had worried about him as he got older, had said to me once, the year before she died, "There's something about that woman he married that I can't put my finger on, Donald. Just watch." I hadn't watched closely enough or soon enough. Michael said, "She'd have been terrifying in that courtroom." I said, "She'd never have let it get to a courtroom." On the afternoon of the second day, my phone rang. Verdict reached. The courtroom filled up in a way it hadn't during the earlier sessions. Word had gotten around. Surgeon's son attempts fraud, recording evidence, the works. There was a row of people I didn't recognize behind the gallery railing. Phones already confiscated at the door, all of them watching with the particular hunger of people who have driven a long way for something. Owen and Stacy were let in. Owen sat down without looking at me. Stacy looked at Gould as though she was still expecting him to produce something. The judge addressed a foreperson, a retired school teacher from Kirkland named, I learned later, Dolores. She was about my age, white-haired, entirely composed. On the charge of forgery in the first degree against Owen Marsh, guilty. Owen's jaw tightened. On the charge of identity theft against Owen Marsh, guilty. Stacy made a small sound. On the charge of insurance fraud against Owen Marsh, guilty. On the charge of criminal conspiracy against Owen Marsh, guilty. Then the foreperson turned to Stacy's charges. Forgery, guilty. Identity theft, guilty. Insurance fraud, guilty. Criminal conspiracy, guilty. Gould immediately requested sentencing be delayed. The judge denied it. These defendants, she said, targeted a family member deliberately and systematically. There is no ambiguity in this record about intent. She set the sentencing date for 3 weeks out. The sentencing hearing was shorter than I expected. Gould argued mitigating factors, no prior criminal record, financial stress, the complexity of the relationship, Owen's genuine love for his father complicated by his wife's influence. Carol countered with the duration of the scheme, the specificity of the planning, the insurance fraud, the fact that they had hired a convicted forger and paid him to produce a fraudulent document that would have stripped a 68-year-old man of the asset he'd spent 30 years building. The judge sentenced Owen to 14 years in the Washington State Department of Corrections. She sentenced Stacy to 14 years as well, equal to Owen's, because as she said plainly, the evidence does not support the claim that one defendant was meaningfully less culpable than the other. She also ordered joint restitution of $387,000, covering my legal fees, the cost of the security system and investigation, and damages. I heard one person in the gallery behind me say quietly, "Good." After the guards had taken them out, I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom with Carol and Michael and let the quiet settle. Carol shook my hand and said, "Clean result, Donald." I thanked her. Michael put his hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. I had asked, through Carol, to have a few minutes with Owen before they processed him. It was granted. He was brought to a small room off the main hallway, handcuffed, 2 guards standing near the door. He looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. His face had the hollowed-out look of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for months and had finally stopped. He said, "You planned all of this from the beginning." I said, "I planned a response. You planned the beginning." He looked at the table between us. He said, "Mom would hate this." I said, "Your mother would have seen it coming before I did. She told me to watch Owen." She said that to me the year before she died. I didn't listen well enough. He didn't say anything to that. I stood up. I said, "You had everything. The house would have been yours eventually. The accounts, the policy, all of it. You only had to wait and not do this. You were 3, maybe 4 years from inheriting everything we built. Instead, you're going to spend the next 14 years thinking about why you couldn't wait." He said quietly, "What are you going to do with it now?" I said, "I'm going to decide what I want." And I left. I sold the Bellevue house 4 months later. It sold in 6 days for $2.1 million, which is what the market does in that part of Washington when you have a greenbelt lot and a sunroom and a kitchen with a burn mark on the table that you leave because it still means something to you. Except I took the table. That came with me. The money I divided as follows: 400,000 to a Seattle nonprofit that provides free legal services to seniors facing elder financial abuse. 300,000 to the University of Washington Medical School Scholarship Fund, specifically for surgical residents from low-income backgrounds. 500,000 into a trust for Michael's two daughters, my granddaughters, ages 7 and 4, who I plan to spend a great deal more time with going forward. The remainder, a little over 800,000 after taxes and fees, I put into a straightforward index portfolio that should sustain me comfortably for the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be. I moved to a smaller house in Edmonds, on a street that ends in a cul-de-sac and smells like cedar and low tide. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a porch that faces west. The kitchen table fits perfectly near the window. On the first morning I woke up there, I sat with coffee and watched the light come over the water and thought about a thing my old chief of surgery used to say during the worst nights in the ICU, when everything had gone wrong and you were the one who had to walk out and speak to the family. Don't confuse the outcome with the work. You do the work. The outcome isn't yours to control. I'd done the work. Slowly, carefully, without anger where I could avoid it. I'd watched and documented and prepared and trusted the system to function, and it had. That's not something I can say with confidence about every system I've ever trusted, but it was true here. The outcome hurt. It still does. There is no version of this story where a father doesn't lose something that can't be recovered. Owen is 41 years old, and he will be 55 when he gets out, assuming good behavior, and whatever relationship might have existed between us after that. I have no language for it yet. Maybe I'll find some. Maybe I won't. But I am 68 years old and I can see the water from my kitchen table, and my younger son drove up last weekend with his daughters, and the 7-year-old sat in my lap and asked me what that smell was, and I told her it was the sea, and she thought about that for a while and then said, "I like it," and I said, "Me too." I spent 32 years holding other people's hearts in my hands and understanding. Each time, the weight of what I was responsible for. You never got used to it exactly. You just got better at carrying it. That's what I tell myself, on the mornings when carrying it feels like the main task. You get better at it. You don't put it down. But you get better at carrying it, and you watch the water, and you make breakfast for your granddaughters, and you try to be the steady one in the room. That's what I know how to do. That's what I'll keep doing. I still think about that Tuesday morning in my kitchen. Owen sitting across from me at the table Sandra and I bought in 1987, telling me I was forgetting things. His face so earnest, his voice so careful. And me, a man who had operated on 4,000 hearts, sitting there and wondering if he was right. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the fraud, not the courtroom. That moment right there, when I almost believed him. There's a particular kind of damage that gets done when someone turns your own decency against you. Owen knew I was the kind of man who second-guessed himself. He'd watched me do it his whole life. And Stacy, who had studied me the way a mechanic studies a machine she intends to strip for parts, understood exactly which lever to pull. If you want to disarm a careful man, tell him he's losing his mind. Watch him doubt himself into stillness. It didn't work, but it almost did, and that almost is worth sitting with. What I know now, after all of it, is that the outcomes we experience in this life are rarely accidents. They're the accumulated weight of every decision made along the way, by us and by the people around us. Owen didn't end up in a courtroom because of bad luck. He ended up there because he made choices, one after another, over months and years, each one a little smaller than his better self, until the distance between who he was and who he could have been became a gap that a jury measured in criminal charges. I'm not angry about it. I was for a while. But anger is expensive, and I'm 68 years old, and I have better uses for what I've got left. What I am is clear-eyed, and I think that's the only thing that saved me. Not cleverness, not resources, not the fact that I happened to have a good attorney and a son in Portland who drove up when I called. It was clarity, the willingness to look at what was actually in front of me instead of what I wished was there. That kind of clear-sightedness is something you have to practice. It doesn't come free. It costs you the comfort of not knowing, and most people would rather pay that price in the other direction. The recordings, the logs, the camera footage, None of that mattered until I was willing to see what I was documenting. Gathering evidence is a technical problem. Accepting what the evidence means is a moral one. That's the harder work. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about standing up for yourself. That before you can act, you have to be willing to know, really know, without softening it. And then, once you know, you have to hold on. You have to get up the next morning and make coffee and sit across from your son at dinner and pass him the corn and not flinch. That kind of endurance, the quiet, daily kind, without any audience, is what actually determines outcomes. Not one dramatic moment of courage, months of ordinary steadiness, repeated until it adds up to something. Owen had every advantage I could have given a child. He had parents who loved each other. He had a house with a green belt and a sunroom. He had a father who would have handed him everything in time if he had simply been patient. And he threw it away chasing something he could have waited for. I think about his younger brother, Michael, who drove up from Portland when I called and stood in my front hallway and didn't say a word, just showed up. That's the whole of it sometimes. Just showing up when someone needs you to. I'm watching the water from my kitchen table most mornings now. It's enough. It's more than enough. And I earned it, not by winning, but by refusing, for a very long time, to pretend I didn't see what I saw.